Great, thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. Hold on. And can everybody see it? We're good? Okay, great. So as Monica said, my name is Stephanie. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to talk today about class as a political identity, and particularly the role of local organizations in creating and sustaining this identity. So when it comes to class as a political identity, the question of death and rebirth is one that has emerged sporadically among social scientists over the past 2 decades, and that's quite a long debate, which I won't recapitulate here, but we'll start from this. So figure 1 shows an image of the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011. And after years of watching the working classes slowly move away from a cohesive political identity or somewhat cohesive political identity associated with democratic partisanship, this was a moment of hope for observers that the financial crisis might be enough to spur on the rebirth of working class politics.
Stephanie, I think we might not be seeing what you're seeing. I see the first, it's not full screen, and it says the first page of like class as a community identity. So I just wanted to.
Thank you. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay.
So it says figure 1. Okay.
Figure 1, great. Okay, and now can you see figure 2?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so this image tells a different story. It charts the percentage of voters from union households, the dashed line, and non-union households, the solid line, who voted for the Democratic presidential candidate in each election from 1948 to 2016, based on the American National Election Studies. The lines show a linear fit between time and Democratic vote share. As we can see, union households are becoming slightly less Democratic over time, while non-union households are becoming slightly more so, such that infamously, by the time of Donald Trump's 2016 election, there was little discernible partisan difference between the two groups. In other words, as we've long known, even the starkest of inequalities are not enough on their own to create a working class politics. In fact, political sociologists and political scientists have spent a lot of time in recent years exploring this, particularly through the lens of growing conservatism of the white working class. And today I'll be focusing on this racialized class identity, as it's long been considered a barrier to working class solidarity in the US. So a lot of recent scholarship in this area tries to make sense of quotes like this one from a young man named Jared who lives in a small town I'll call Williston in Minnesota. Jared is in trade school and working part-time in retail when we meet. When he finishes school, he'll join the same construction union as his father. This is what he tells me of the Democratic Party during a conversation in the spring of 2020. They used to stand for the working class of people, like middle class, union workers, people who weren't in the upper middle class and above. They used to stand for people who couldn't necessarily stand up for themselves. Now, from what I've seen, they only stand up for whoever is going to give them the most money. Given these understandings of the parties, the Republicans are Jared's preference. But over the past 2 years, I've met a lot of people who are like Jared, but who live in a different town and who view the parties differently. For example, consider Quinn, who lives in a small town much like Williston, which I'll call Iverson in Wisconsin. Quinn was working as both a barista and a waitress when we first met. She votes irregularly, has never been part of a union, and was nervous to talk about politics during our first conversation. She felt she didn't know enough to have a conversation about politics. As she tells me, I tend to lean more towards the Democrats. Sorry. And just because, again, I don't know that much, but the Republicans, to me, they're just, it seems, this is a stereotype, but they're the rich people. That's what it seems to me. Like usually the Democrats are the middle class people who are trying to get fairness for everybody. And then the Republicans seem like the opposite. But again, maybe I could be wrong. As you can see, Quinn second guesses herself here. She's often unsure of what the parties actually do represent and doesn't have a trusted source of news. But even so, this belief the Democrats are for the working people leads her to identify more closely with them. So what explains these differences between Quinn and Jared? To answer this question, my dissertation has followed 3 blue-collar counties, predominantly white, centered around small towns in the Midwest, which I'll refer to as Iverson, Maryville, and Williston, from May of 2019 to November 2020. They're nearly identical demographically, and all 3 were part of the New Deal coalition in the 1930s and 40s. But since the 60s, they've gone in different directions. Maryville became Republican, Williston became kind of a swing county, and Iverson is the only one that remains Democratic. So today I'm going to focus on what it is about Iverson that means that it's the only of my 3 cases, and more generally, one of relatively few blue-collar white Midwestern counties still voting Democratic, and how that relates to the political identities of the American working class more broadly. So to understand this, let's go back to Quinn. Like many people I spoke to in Iverson, regardless of their sort of objective class position or union status, Quinn regularly expresses what I call a Uniontown worldview, which contains three crucial understandings. First, that both the community's social problems and national challenges are driven by a structural inequality, which disadvantages their community. So their community is on the side of the have-nots in an unequal system through no fault of their own. And third, that the party system expresses this class divide, with Democrats fighting for the have-nots, often by supporting unions and bringing the state to level the playing field. So these same understandings are available to some extent in Williston, most often among current union members, but in both Maryville and Williston, I heard just as often that Democrats used to be the party of the worker, as Jared's comments indicate. So what matters most for our purposes is understanding what it is about living in Iverson that perpetuates a community level identification as have-nots and a notion that the Democrats represent them best. And as community leaders and residents often tell me, it's because of the unions. Iverson is a quote unquote union town built on the back of labor. And in the post Act 10 and right to work world of Wisconsin, the importance of unions is not just about numbers, although those matter, but about how they're integrated into local politics through ties to one another and elected officials. The local labor council, the Iverson Federation of Labor, or IFL, is central to this. Labor councils gather together different AFL-CIO locals in a community for both community engagement and political activism. They are, for the most part, depleted in the US. There's not that many of them, and the ones that do exist are relatively defunct. But while the IFL is no longer the political force that it once was, it still provides a forum for different union locals to meet monthly in Iverson and endorse candidates for local office and support one another's concerns. As a result, Iverson is the only of my three communities, despite Williston's history of fairly militant labor activism and a relatively strong unionization rate today. It's the only community that has something we could reasonably think of as a labor movement that agitates politically and holds elected officials accountable to voting for labor-friendly measures. In fact, labor leaders often are the elected officials in Iverson. Crucially, the tight web of connections between labor and local government means that Iverson's leaders almost universally define their community's problems as rooted in the lack of good jobs, the result of a structural decline beyond their control, which requires external resources to address. As they view it, the other challenges they face all stem from this. The opioid crisis in particular is a symptom of poverty and inadequate wages. Now, this might seem an unsurprising interpretation of the problems of a post-industrial community, but contrast this to Maryville and Williston, where community leaders understand very similar social problems, a dearth of adequate workforce housing and a surfeit of drugs, as either individual problems or barriers to attracting business. Iverson is a community in service to their workers, while Maryville is a community in service to their businesses.
You have 2 minutes.
Great, thank you. And this is the organizational context within which the Uniontown worldview emerges and is perpetuated. So what lessons can we draw from Iverson about working class politics more broadly? First, it doesn't take much for organized labor to accomplish what it accomplishes in Iverson. In small town politics,
You're muted, Stephanie.
was I muted? Okay, sorry, I think I'm unmuted now. So second, my research also suggests, so basically it doesn't take much to achieve this level of political clout, but there's big payoffs because it affects not just union members, but the community more broadly. And through not that much organizational infrastructure, unions and local government together create a working class democratic community out of much the same demographic material as Maryville and Williston, which do not. This also suggests that the local organization of American politics can offer an opportunity for the labor movement or other working class organizations to regain a foothold in shaping working class political identities. The localized labor movement in the US, which forces unions to win battles plant by plant, rather than through bargaining sector by sector and tripartite negotiations, has often been seen as a disadvantage, but Iverson indicates that there's a latent power in this structure, particularly in small town politics. If working class organizations can integrate themselves into local governance arrangements and community life, becoming community actors, not just sort of bargaining organizations. And finally, this case shows us that a viable working class political identity can be built within the existing party system. By definition, the United States Big Tent coalition-based parties have many different meanings at any given time. What matters is how these meanings are translated to voters through local institutional arrangements, the media, and social networks in a way that resonates with their lived experiences. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for starting us off. Fabulous presentation on the role of politics and the possibility of revitalizing the labor-based politics. Next, we are going to hear from Lauren Shuda, who is assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Texas at Austin.
All right, hi everyone. Can you see my screen? It should be title screen. Okay, great. So today you can think of what I'll be doing as kind of a soapbox pitch for people to spend more investment both in research, what you're actually studying on broad access public higher education, and that we need more actual financial investments from our government in the same. So I'm going to start with kind of some splashy headlines of some recent proposals for how the private sector in education could potentially be the savior for the American working class. So this includes some ideas, a working paper and report from Harvard that was arguing if we can just think about broadening access of these elite private institutions by finding a way to basically reduce the tuition, then maybe they can actually start improving social mobility for more than just the elite. Similarly, there was a recent New York Times opinion piece that was arguing we should just have places like Stanford produce satellite campuses to, again, broaden access to elite higher education. And then a similar piece that's making basically the same pitch. If we just get these very competitive colleges to open up their access to more Americans, then maybe we'll see this return to an idea of social mobility through higher education. So I guess I'm going to be frank here and say I fundamentally disagree with these proposals. And part of the reason is that we've had broadening access to higher education for decades, and the elite institutions have only gotten more selective in that time. And so it seems very unlikely that these institutions, which are very powerful, I realize I'm saying this to an event organized from a private institution, but we haven't seen a change so far. It seemed highly unlikely, especially given the power that certain institutions have in political conversations, that we would see fundamental reform of very selective institutions in the United States. Instead, what I think we need to do is think about making sure that we're providing quality education to the institutions where the bulk of Americans actually get their education from. So most elite institutions in the United States have actually not increased their capacity as we've seen this rapid expansion over the past several decades in higher education access. So the selective colleges are more selective than ever. Only 3% of students that attend college go to a college that accepts under a quarter of the applicants, and only 20% attend an institution that's accepting less than half of the applicants. So most people are actually going to institutions that are what I would call broad access. They let in the majority of the people that apply to go there. So they have very minimal admissions requirements. So the other thing to note is that public colleges serve the majority of students in the United States. So if you were to look at, the federal government will release information about the different types of institutions. There are actually far more private nonprofit colleges in the country than any other type of institution, but most students are served by public institutions. And so you see the breakdown on the far left bar is showing you that about a third of those students in the public sector are attending two-year colleges. That includes community colleges and technical colleges. And then the remainder are at four-year institutions or institutions that offer a bachelor's degree and higher. A far smaller proportion of students are at private nonprofits. And then there's also the private for-profit sector, which was expanding for a long time. Now it's contracting a little bit. And given our limited time, I don't have that much time to go into the private for-profits, but we can talk about them in the discussion. They also serve a lot of working class students, but I would say not with good in mind. So broad access public colleges are community and technical colleges. So those are the 2-year and below institutions, and regional comprehensives. So regional comprehensives are the term that I use for your local university that is primarily serving students in that region, and they tend to have lower or minimal admission standards. So these institutions are more likely to serve non-white students, first-generation college students, and students from low-income family. So this is really the institutions that serve the American working class. They tend to be underfunded because there's been dramatic decreases in per student funding over time, but especially during the Great Recession that has never recovered. These students have greater needs for their students because the students have a lot of external obligations. And a lot of times they come from the K-12 system that really underserve them. They're not as prepared when they get to college. And not surprising, we therefore see lower persistence and graduation rates at these institutions, a lot of times because of the backgrounds that students bring with them and lower academic preparation, and also that the institutions don't have adequate funding to provide the resources that students need to make it through college, as they have far less money per student than a lot of the selective institutions in the country. So during the recession, there were decreased state expenditures that were paired with increased student enrollment. So all 50 states decreased the share of revenues that were going to public colleges in their states, and the majority of those states ended up putting those additional costs per student back onto the students. So they increased their tuition to make sure that they could cover the costs. So ultimately that meant more people were going to college in order to try to improve their labor market outcomes in the recession. And they were having to pay even more to try to get those returns from higher education. So this is just giving you a sense of kind of where we were as of 2018. So there were 40 states that were still spending less per student than their pre-recession level. So there were huge cuts in state higher education allocations during the recession, and we've never recovered. And my guess is, if you think about what's happening right now, it's only going to get worse. So we hadn't recovered, and now we're facing a situation where states are going to be having a lot of budgetary problems in the face of the pandemic. And it's very likely we could see something very similar happen, where there's even more dramatic cuts. So basically, we're facing this serious issue of state divestment in higher education when these are the institutions that serve the bulk of students that really would benefit from higher education. So my policy pitches to improve the college and labor market outcomes for the working class would be that we need to increase need-based financial aid. So that's expanding the Pell buying power. So the Pell Grant has basically remained fairly stable. How much funding is given to students from low-income families has held pretty constant over time, despite the fact that tuition has been growing dramatically. So it really doesn't offset tuition that much at this point in time. And also that we should ideally make the first 2 years of college at any public higher education institution free. I would note that a lot of the movements in states and the current proposal by the Biden administration emphasizes a first 2 years of community college for free, where the Biden proposal also includes some additional incentives for going to HBCUs and tribal colleges. But it pretty much ignores the broad access four-year institutions, public institutions, where they're also serving a lot of students who are Black students and students from low-income families, first-generation college students. Got it, thanks. So they're kind of missing a piece of the puzzle, and there are some challenges with trying to push everyone into community colleges. primarily some mismatch between community colleges and their four-year counterparts that make it hard for people to get a bachelor's degree if they started at a community college. So I'm happy to talk about that issue if it comes up later. But essentially trying to make sure that we have policy proposals that serve students where they are, rather than trying to force them to go somewhere else. Because it's very difficult to actually shift those processes, whether it's trying to force the elite institutions to accept more students, or trying to get students to attend a different type of institution for the benefit of going to college for 2 years for free and then transfer somebody somewhere else. It doesn't seem like the ideal situation to try to offset some of the financial burden that students face. The other big financial investment would be trying to make sure that we also see investment in the institutions themselves, where if you're going to be having institutions that are primarily supporting students from low-income backgrounds, you need to offer them holistic support services. So there are programs that have been very effective. One of them is called CUNY ASAP. It has wraparound support structures. That means helping students get the social services that they need. That could even mean, applying for food stamps and things like that, getting childcare and academic supports like tutoring. And by doing that, it's dramatically increased the number of students that are actually getting a degree. But this requires permanent increased funding at broad access institutions, which are right now very constrained financially. So my other big pitch in terms of what we can do as sociologists would be, I would love to see a greater focus on these post-secondary institutions that serve the majority of Americans. So that means the community and technical colleges, the regional comprehensives, and to some extent, even the for-profits, and how the for-profits interact with what's happening at those broad access public higher education institutions. And that includes looking into how do we best improve outcomes and how do we move policy to do so. And I really emphasize the point that we need to study this more as sociologists, because I think there's a lot of emphasis on what's happening in terms of access and experiences at elite private institutions. And it's just very unlikely that those are going to be the path to social mobility for the majority of working class Americans. And then the other big pitch would be working to gain more experience on interacting with policy. So now is the time to try to get a sense of how does policy making work? What is effective public scholarship? And how do you kind of get involved in that rather than speaking within the academic bubble? And I think, at least when I think of my training as a sociologist, it was a real reality check when I started doing more policy-oriented work. And I felt like, wow, I don't know how to make a pitch for changing policy. It was very difficult. And it's been a learning process, but you can start that if you're a grad student, you can start that learning process now. And the earlier you start trying to get a sense of how this stuff works, the more comfortable you'll be over time. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was really fabulous and thought-provoking. Virtual claps. We are now going to hear from Leah Rupaner, who is an associate professor of sociology and co-director of the policy lab at the University of Melbourne. And she is in fact speaking to us from Australia, where it's around 6:30 a.m. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and delightful to Lauren. It's perfect to come after you because you're making a pitch for an investment in higher education, and I'm now going to make the pitch for the investment in childcare. So we're perfectly sequenced. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing. I'm going to make the pitch for childcare and investments and school, thinking about childcare as infrastructure, and especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to acknowledge that this is a project with co-authors Katie Collins at Washington University in St. Louis, Kristen Landivar at University of Maryland, and Buddy Scarborough at University of North Texas. So Monica, don't panic, but I'm going to try to get through a few papers in a book in 10 minutes. So don't have a heart attack. I think I can do it. Let's see how I go. I'm going to walk you through a bunch of research that we've done under the pandemic. Everything's open access. So I'm going to go through quickly, but if you want to have more detail of our papers, they're up, available. So one of the things we know quite clearly is that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted women's employment. We're seeing women have experienced higher job loss, slower recovery. They're clustered in the industries hardest hit by the pandemic, and they have been disproportionately responsible for the childcare, which makes employment very difficult in light of school closures. And this pandemic is being called a she session. If you look at these data from the BLS, you can see that women's employment is pretty much on par with the rate from 1987, so major dips. And the most recent job reports that came out today, I think, are showing that the job recovery has slowed. So one of the things we were asking is, what does this mean for parents? Some were arguing at the beginning of the pandemic that this was going to be a moment of a gender revolution. We were more worried that this was going to widen gender gaps. Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you it's done the second, even though we hope it had done the first. So one of the things we were interested in looking at was what was happening, exactly at that moment in time when the economy shut down, right? When, take from February into April and everything shut, what happened for mothers? So we published an article in Feminist Frontiers and we asked exactly this question. And what we found, oh, sorry, I knew I had this slide for you. This is basically the period of time, March. I'm using US restaurant bookings, but you could use any kind of indicator. So this is before the pandemic, and this is when basically the economy kind of shut, only reopened. We took the US current population survey, we restricted it to dual earner, married, heterosexual parents, and we followed them because it's a longitudinal panel from February to April 2020. What we found is, this is, again, I'm gonna walk you through this, don't panic. I know I'm throwing a lot at you in a very short period of time, but you're very smart people, so I know this is no drama. This is for a dual earner heterosexual household, so both partners are married, heterosexual couples. And what we found was, for those with little kids in the home, 1 to 5, that mothers reduced their work hours. It had no impact on fathers. By April, they were reducing their work hours. Mothers with school-age children also reduced their work hours, no significant association for fathers. And we saw that both mothers and fathers with kids that are older reduced their work hours by about 1 hour per week. Of course, we know that mothers work less than fathers on average. So this is taking, these are fathers right here at 42 hours. This is those with school-age children, older school-aged, elementary and preschool age. And you can see fathers' hours are more or less intact at 40 to 42 hours. But where we see the biggest drops over time is in particular for those with little kids in the home, where mothers started to reduce their work time. We were interested in what happens in the couples where both could telecommute, right? In theory, these should be people who should be able to fill that gap because both are home and able to work from home. What we found was that yes, for those with kids that were 6 to 12, so school-age children, amongst telecommuting couples where both could telecommute, there was no reduction in work hours. But with mothers with little kids in the home, by April, they had reduced their work hours by 2.6 hours per week. So it did not buffer mothers with little kids. And for fathers, where both could telecommute, no significant association. Again, this is just kind of graphing these results, just showing you that the gender gap widened, especially for those with school-age and preschool-age kids from February to March over time for telecommuting couples. This is just kind of a little general thing that basically the gender gap grew by 20 to 50%. Telecommuting buffered some, but not those with little kids in the home. I just want to show off a little bit and show you, we then looked at comparing mothers to women without children, married. And this is in SOCIAS. It's just a data visualization. I'm going to skip it in the interest of time, but be impressed. Then we asked, okay, so what I hope you're getting at right now is women are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. Mothers are being hit hard. Telecommuting didn't seem to buffer them enough. It wasn't the solution. And so we were trying to understand what's the problem. And what we thought the problem was school closures. So this came out in Gender and Society. Oh, and what I want to show is I wrote a book. So I'll take your applause. Thank you very much. So we thought what was critical to mothers being knocked out of employment was a lack of childcare. So childcare is a critical piece of infrastructure. And I wrote a book that came out last year in which I was interested in mapping how childcare resources vary across states. What is the difference in terms of childcare resources and other infrastructure that exists across states? And what I found was in states like these that we often think are quite progressive, that school days were short, after school care was difficult to access, childcare was very expensive, and mothers were much more likely to stay at home. They didn't work. So I found that actually it really was contingent upon where you lived, determined the type of childcare resources and gender empowerment resources. So if you're a mother living in California versus living in Nebraska versus living in DC, you're negotiating very different institutional contexts. I wrote this book before a global pandemic came out, and we were very clear on the ways in which states function differently in terms of the responses to keeping schools open or keeping economies open. So that was a bit of an unintentional accident that worked out. So one of the things we were interested in doing, and this is for the gender and society piece that's already been published. At this moment in time, we've collected the elementary school operating status database. This is a Russell Sage funded project. And what we did is we've collected, it's a comprehensive database at the district level about their operating status in September, and we're recollecting right now in April. At this moment in time, we only had 26 states, but we now have all of them, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. So we're taking those with 500 students, and we have 9,000 school districts across the US, Puerto Rico, and DC. One of the things we did is we aggregated them up to account for student population size. We merged them with the current population survey, and we linked them, comparing those living in states in 2019 pre-pandemic and 2020, restricting to parents with school-age children in the home, 5 to 12, elementary school children in the home. And what we did for this piece was we compared 3 states with very different reopening status: Maryland, that was fully remote; New York, that was hybrid; and Texas, where the majority was face-to-face. What we found was in a state like Maryland that was fully remote, mothers' labor force participation dropped by 16%. No significant, sorry?
2 minutes.
Oh God, no significant association for fathers. I'm gonna go a little bit more quick. And then when we looked at whether we pooled them together, we could see that in primarily remote states, mothers' employment dropped as well. That's a conclusion. When schools closed, mothers didn't work. We now have a complete data set with 25 million elementary school students. It's publicly accessible. If you want to access it, it's there. And I'll just show you kind of what's happening across all 50 states. That you can see in the West Coast states, this is remote, hybrid, and person. You can see the West Coast states went predominantly remote. The middle of the country went mostly in person. And then some variation across the Eastern Seaboard between remote, hybrid, and in-person learning. If you look at it at the district level, you can see there is significant heterogeneity within states. So I'm just going to bring my little cursor up. A state like Texas, for example, you can see some districts went fully remote, where some went in person, but you can see clusterings at the district level. We were interested in how that's associated with maternal employment. Since I know I only have 2 minutes, I'm just going to tell you, as more schools in these states closed, like they had less in-person learning, that mothers dropped out of the labor force. If states remained fully open, the gender gap didn't change. When we look at the racial composition of the school districts to see how that explains school operating status, we see that school districts that had majority white students were most likely to open in person. School districts that had a higher concentration of Hispanic students, half of them, or 62% of them, were open either remote or hybrid. Oh, sorry, I have that wrong. Sorry, 50% went remote, and then this is the hybrid, apologies. And same with majority Black schools. So we have another paper where we looked at how it happened to their health, but I want to make a last policy ditch argument. So I hope what you're seeing from right now is that mothers dropped out of employment at higher rates, that school reopening was a really critical piece of infrastructure to help mothers remain employed, that school opening really was occurring in districts with a high concentration of white students. And so what this means for widening gender gaps is racialized gaps in employment is really critical in the next step in the project. And then finally, my pitch for solutions. We were interested in how to identify, if we think about childcare as an infrastructure, and we're showing you that school closures really actually knocked women out of employment, what about that kind of childcare piece at the beginning? So we were interested in looking at what was happening in the GFC. If we looked at a previous recession, can we see how childcare played a critical role in keeping mothers employed? Keeping families out of poverty. So we looked at the GFC, and we took data from the American Community Survey from 2016 to 2006 to 2016, and we linked it to Head Start enrollment status. We had about 1.5 million families across all 50 states. Head Start, even though it's a federal program, and this comes through my book quite clearly, even though it's a federal program, the percentage of children who get access to it varies dramatically across states. So you can see a state like North Dakota and South Dakota, 100% of eligible children are enrolled. Compare that to a state like Nevada, 22%. So Head Start varies across states. We then linked it to see what happened to family poverty. And you can see that if we think of childcare as critical to keeping middle families out of poverty, we show that. Monica's going to tell me to get off. We basically show that in states where they had higher Head Start enrollment at the start of the GFC, they had fewer families fell into poverty and quicker recoveries. If you compare states that are very similar, Mississippi to Alabama, Arkansas to Oklahoma, but have very different rates of eligible Head Start, you can see that they have quicker returns, fewer families fell into poverty. And so that is it. I'm going to make my last argument that if we want to have a healthy, happy, thriving middle class, you need women in employment. We know that women and mothers' employment, dual earner households are one of the things that buffered many families from the declining earnings of men, and mothers are critical to keeping families in the middle class. If you want mothers to work, you need them to have access to childcare and schools. It's like a no-brainer, right? It's like a no-brainer. Give them access to childcare, give them access to school. And so one of the things I just want to hit on is we need to think about this as a critical infrastructure piece, as a way to ensure that we have equality in employment. I'm done, Monica, don't worry, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was really fabulous, really important work. Next up, we are going to hear from John N. Robinson III, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis and a PhD from Northwestern University.
Thank you, Monica. Starting my timer here. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to just thank Monica for setting up this panel and for really cultivating this intellectual space, problem-solving sociology. And I hope it's okay that I don't have slides. So we're moving from investment in education and childcare, and now we're moving on to housing. So it just fits right along in the same line. So before I started, I did want to make a brief framing comment. So we're obviously having a discussion about policy solutions here, which I think is unavoidably technical. But I truly believe that the technical side of policy is inseparable from the political side of policy. And so in other words, I believe that anything worth having policy-wise is probably something that we're going to have to fight for through movements, mobilization, and doing whatever is necessary to make our votes count and get the right people into elected office. And so my solutions here are really just ideas and possibilities that I think we should consider worth fighting for. And so now, today I'm talking about reimagining the public role in housing finance, but let me first sort of touch on the problem. According to recent studies, in 2019, more than 30% of all households were cost burdened, which means that they spent more than at least 30%, but often more on their income on housing costs. Renters make up a disproportionately large share of that group. And of course, racial minorities are overrepresented among renters. Now, we hope for a world where everyone has access to jobs with a livable wage, where they can afford the basic dignities of life. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world just yet. And so much of the housing problem really boils down to a lacking supply of homes affordable to the great number of people who actually don't receive a livable wage. And so recent studies have shown that the US is at least 7 million units, but likely much more than that, short of the level of affordable housing that would be sufficient to meet the needs of low income families and individuals. And so we don't have enough affordable housing, that's the problem. Okay, so on to my solution, and not to disappoint, but my solution isn't really mine. It picks up from an idea that others have proposed recently. So it's hard to remember, but last January and February in 2020, there was this big thing happening called the Democratic presidential primary. It's really easy to forget now, but the progressive left actually offered lots of housing proposals, but there was really only one proposal that won broad consensus among the candidates. And that was this idea of building on and expanding the reach of something called the National Housing Trust Fund. And it's a proposal that was championed by the largest housing advocacy group for the poor, which is called the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so this housing trust fund is essentially a fund earmarked specifically for producing housing for low income families. And it's allocated to the states in the form of a block grant. And so in some ways, it's a weird consensus choice because so far, this trust fund has been chronically underfunded. It's been sabotaged by GOP-led states, and it actually hasn't produced much affordable housing overall. And so there's more to it, and I'll explain a few more details, but I did want to discuss here why I think folks have converged around this proposal and extrapolate two related possibilities that I think this proposal actually speaks to. So first and most straightforwardly, the Housing Trust Fund proposal is about expanding the government's role in supporting what I call debt-free housing, and it's otherwise known as rental housing. And so we know that in the US, there's a long legacy of federal support for homeowners and the ideal of homeownership. And we know that that legacy is very regressive. It's upwardly redistributive and the source of so much economic precarity and financial despair for a large swath of our population. And so the National Housing Trust Fund proposal is really about, it's a part of this growing momentum around the idea that renting and not home ownership should be central to our public mission. And it's time for us to advocate just as hard for renting, for the virtue and dignity of that, and for the need to make that a policy priority. And so we've already heard calls to downsize and possibly abolish the home mortgage interest deduction from sociologists like Isaac Martin, Matt Desmond, and Thomas Shapiro, among others. So this is along the same lines. And some other potential benefits for expanding government support for renting, I think, is that it would open up a more affordable, a more sort of naturally affordable segment of the market for lots of people, including people without homes right now, including renters who are cost burdened, and also homeowners who are cost burdened, who might lead easier lives actually as renters. It would also simplify, I think, the financial aspects of housing, whether we're talking about mortgage qualifications, to home value appreciation, to property taxes, all of which are big engines of inequality. And I think it would also simplify the process of regulating owners like landlords and lenders to better address some of the racially discriminatory problems that they perpetuate, including eviction and foreclosure. So the last point that I want to make here is more explicitly about housing finance, but it's that one way to make renting or debt-free housing, whatever you want to call it, more central to our public mission as a society would be to think more intentionally, I think, about amplifying the state's redistributive power, not just through direct government intervention, but also and especially within public-private arrangements. So progressive critiques, I think, frequently center on this need to expand direct public ownership, for example, increasing public housing production, which I think is pretty essential. And I'm happy that during last year's Democratic primary, there was actually an unprecedented number, well, not unprecedented, but there was a lot more emphasis on the need to reinvest in public housing relative to many decades before. But remember that public housing itself is not fully public. That program actually involves lots of private sector involvement. And in any case, I think our progressive imagination needs to go beyond public housing toward also envisioning what a radical overhaul of public-private arrangements might look like. And so here I'm thinking of, for example, something like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, otherwise known as the government-sponsored enterprises, the GSEs. Note that each year public housing usually accounts for less than $8 billion in spending, while these GSEs control and manage trillions of dollars annually. Many of us understandably dismiss these GSEs as agencies that caused the financial crisis and that wrecked the economy. But I think that we should also think more about these GSEs alongside other public-private kind of arrangements as a particular instrument of state power and as a target for some of the political claims that we make, one that can potentially be reshaped toward more progressive ends. Here's where the National Housing Trust Fund comes back in. So it's funded by revenues from these GSEs, which generate revenues mostly by providing financial services to the credit market for homeowners. And then this housing trust fund explicitly redistributes that money to finance housing for low-income renters. So the idea behind this National Housing Trust Fund proposal is that this operation can and should be massively expanded, this redistributive operation, which would shift the state's financial might toward renters as opposed to homeowners. This proposal dovetails with policy recommendations by scholarly voices who have pushed for the socialization of financial services for the poor. And so, for example, I'm thinking here of Mirza Baradaran's book, How the Other Half Banks, where she advocates for an expansion of postal banking. Of course, nothing beats tax and spend redistribution, as in Elizabeth Warren's and Bernie Sanders' proposals for a wealth tax. But the point here is that redistribution also happens in other ways, and this GSE thing is an example of that. And so here we can think of the National Housing Trust Fund proposal as only a starting point. Progressive thinkers have also advanced more far-reaching proposals. Thank you. Far-reaching proposals for overhauling these GSEs, ranging from full nationalization to a public utility model to a nonprofit cooperative ownership model. And here I'm pulling from research by policy scholar Ingrid Ellen Gold and colleagues. So to conclude, all of this, I think, is about this idea of reimagining the public role in the financial operations that make housing, both affordable and otherwise, possible. So that we can better suppress or eliminate the profit motive, strengthen and regulate and better strengthen and regulate and coordinate the private sector, and then ultimately commit the full power of the state toward realizing good public policy goals, like making rental homes more affordable, livable, and secure for families in need. And what I'm saying here is that I think this is something that I think we should consider it worth fighting for. And so I want to thank you guys for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, John. Any talk that mentions abolishing HMID is definitely close to my heart. Finally, we have Ruth Milkman, who probably doesn't need an introduction. She is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's written many books. She's a past president of the ASA. Let's turn it over to Ruth.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you for this invitation, and thank you all for being here. My talk is kind of an old-fashioned one. I'm just going to make the basic pitch for why unions, labor unions, are one key to the assignment here, how to rebuild the American working class, or as one speaker said, the middle class. I guess rebuilding the working class puts them into the middle class by many people's lights. And of course, this is just one ingredient, along with expanded access to higher education, housing, childcare, and of course, I agree completely with the implications of Stephanie's talk, but to have a labor presence in politics, you kind of need organized labor. So I think all these things fit together pretty nicely. I would like to share my screen, and it just, oh, here we go. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to start with some, basic facts and figures on union decline. Forgive me for those to whom this is old hat. No, I can't even see my own slides. Let me move this over. So the labor, 2029, how did I have that figure? That's supposed to say 2019, forgive me. There are 14 some million members in labor unions today in the United States, this is bad. I am having trouble advancing the slides.
I think you might be able to advance by clicking on the arrow. Yeah.
There we go. Okay. I'm a little technologically challenged, it seems, today. Okay. So that means about 90% of workers are not union members, obviously. In the public sector, the rate is quite a bit higher than that. Of course, the public sector is a relatively small part of the labor market. You can see the disparity there, and that has expanded dramatically over the years. union membership has not been as low as it is today for over a century. So you've all heard the talk of how this is a new Gilded Age. This is one of the many ways in which that's true. So here you can see the decline in the last few decades. Just basically a straight downward line with the well, there's a few bumps, but essentially it's a relentless story of decline. And if you look at the longer view here, you can see what, just the numbers that validate what I said before. It's a little more complicated because we didn't have any public sector unions hardly in 1917. And so, really, if you leave them out, it would be even lower than it was then, but you get the point. Not only do unions have fewer members today, but they have a lot less leverage than they once did. And one indication of that is strikes and their decline in frequency. So I'll show you a chart in a minute, but you can see the numbers here that in the 1970s, there were roughly 300 strikes a year, and that only counts like large workplaces. And then by today, it's 15 per year with this steady decline. It's really the 80s is the turning point, as in so many other things. The other thing is that even if you, the strikes that do still exist are often not like in the old days. They are often provoked by employers. So for example, a union contract comes to an end, the employer makes an offer it knows that the union cannot accept because it involves, dramatic concessions, and then the union goes on strike, which is what the employer wants, and that's a way of just weakening the union rather than it being a sign of militancy. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't these days. You may remember a couple of years ago in 2018, all those teacher strikes, and those, among others, led to a slight turnaround in the numbers, but most of them were in the public sector, which doesn't mean they don't count, but it's the real problem that organized labor has is in the private sector. So although there are spillover effects sometimes, so that was a hopeful moment. The other thing that we're seeing that's reminiscent of the first Gilded Age is that at the pre-New Deal era, basically, we're seeing more short, what are sometimes called demonstration strikes, where workers walk out for a day as opposed to for months or whatever. And that's becoming more common, I think, reflecting the fact that conditions are so much more like they were in 1920 as they were in 1970, say. An example of that would be the fast food worker strikes that some of you probably saw in the so-called Fight for 15. That would be one example. So this is just showing the numbers on the decline in strikes, which are, it bounces around a little bit, basically, again, a story of relentless decline. So why does this matter, you may ask? I think you all know this, but deunionization has dramatically contributed to growing inequality. This is just one factoid from a piece that's quite well known in this area, an ASR article by Bruce Western and Jake Rosenfeld. So the data are a little old, but it shows you the story. And there are other studies that, confirm this. Aside from just wage inequality, union members are much more likely than their non-union counterparts to have defined benefit pensions, employer-provided health care, and other benefits. So it's the overall compensation package, not just wages. Of course, union members are much more likely to have some kind of employment security, not 100%, but much better than in their non-union counterparts. And so the decline of unions also has contributed a lot to, this buzzword in my field of labor studies, rising precarity. And touching back on Stephanie's topic, decline in union political power, decline in unionism does contribute to less political power for working people and their voices. Although I must say the unions have more political influence than you might expect given the pathetic density figures, the rate of unionization, but still, as it gets eroded, that limits the scope of laws that unions campaign for, things like minimum wage laws and paid leave laws, although, well, we have seen some improvements in those arenas. So to turn this around obviously requires more than, quite a big effort. one thing it requires is organizing, and there have been some hopeful signs in that arena, but well, as I'll explain, that's probably not sufficient to turn things around. But nevertheless, we have seen since the Great Recession, some very exciting organizing initiatives, disproportionately though, among college educated young workers. Some of you may have been involved in some of these things. Adjunct faculty are organizing like crazy, teaching assistants as well. Journalists, both online journalists and traditional newsrooms, have shown a big uptick recently in unionization. The teacher strikes I already mentioned. And then there's also a bunch of, non-traditional labor organizing, not in traditional labor unions, but in other forms. And I don't have time to get into all the details, but one example is the walkouts at Google and some other tech companies, mostly partly over workplace issues, but these people get paid very well. They're not trying to get more money for themselves. These were motivated by concerns about social issues. And then the Fight for 15, what I already mentioned, which started as a campaign among fast food workers.
To hear 2 minutes, Ruth.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't even see you on the screen, so thanks for saying it out loud. The Fight for 15 was mounted by a traditional union, one of the largest ones, the Service Employees, SEIU. As you may have noticed, we've seen a bunch of hikes in minimum wages in various cities and states around the country, which is, I think this campaign can be credited for creating the momentum for that, but they did not get a single union member out of it as of yet, which was part of the plan. But anyway, we can talk about that later if people are interested in. Another kind of recent organizing is sometimes called alt labor, again, non-union organizations that try to campaign to improve things, particularly for the most precarious workers who don't have much access to unions, like domestic workers, day laborers, restaurant workers. And of course, we've seen some recent protests in the last year among so-called essential workers, many of them also low-wage workers. And then finally, the most high-profile case, which you all, I'm sure, heard about, the dramatic defeat of the retail and wholesale department store union in Bessemer, Alabama, at their Amazon fulfillment center, as they call it there. Of course, that was a dramatic defeat, but it was an important organizing initiative nonetheless. And that brings me to my final, I guess it's not my final slide. I'm going to rush through this. We have seen much more support for unions in the general public in recent years, particularly among young people. I'm going to skip this one since I'm almost out of time. But the big thing is that organizing is great, and some of labor's decline is due to the paucity of organizing efforts in the last few decades. But really, the playing field is totally stacked in favor of management. If you followed the Amazon saga at all, you probably understand that already. So, as at Amazon, when faced with a union drive, especially in big companies, there's a whole industry of labor consultants, basically lawyers, who help companies defeat those drives. And that is just standard operating procedure. There was nothing surprising about what happened at Amazon. And I'm going to wrap up with this last point. So what is to be done I guess that was our question and the assignment Monica gave us all. One thing that would help a lot is a change in labor law. And so there is this proposed piece of legislation now before Congress, passed by the House, stuck in the Senate, like so many other things, which is called the PRO Act. It stands for Protecting the Right to Organize. And you can see some of the provisions listed in the slide. It basically would attempt to restore labor law to the state it was in back in the old days when it was first legislated, in 1935, when workers in the United States first got the right to unionize. That particularly since the 70s, there's been dramatic erosion and manipulation of the law that makes it almost impossible to win an organizing drive. It's a miracle that any of them succeed. The Amazon story is very typical. Notice, I'm not going to go through all the stuff. We can talk about it more later if people want, but one of the interesting features of this, which is a new element, there have been many attempts to win labor law reform in recent decades, but this is the first one that would give freelancers, or sometimes they're called 1099 workers, the right to unionize. So that's kind of an interesting twist that is new in this particular proposal. So I'll just stop there. Thank you. Sorry, I think I went a little over.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for this really, really interesting panel. Let's